In the 19th and even early 20th century, the scientific community had a rather peculiar view of Stone Age humans. Ancient people were seen as perpetually hungry savages, whose every moment was a brutal fight for survival. The discovery of Paleolithic cave paintings was initially met with skepticism. However, studies of existing tribes that still practice hunting and gathering have shown that even in less favorable environments, they only spend a few hours a day obtaining food. Just like in any pre-industrial society, child mortality rates were high. For instance, the Hadza tribe in Africa has a child mortality rate of 21%, which is actually lower than in 19th century Imperial Russia. Although the chances of living to 60 or 70 were slim, hunter-gatherers were far from being starving vagabonds, and they had more free time than modern people. That's because they had no concept of work, as we understand it today, nor did they experience wealth inequality. After all, when everything you need can be made in 30 minutes using basic materials, what's there to compete over? Activities like hunting, fishing, and gathering, which we now call hobbies, were their daily life. However, as humans settled in fertile river valleys, they sometimes found themselves in a demographic trap when the population grew too large for hunting and gathering to sustain it. The solution to this crisis was the advent of agriculture and animal husbandry. At first, these tasks were carried out by kinship-based communities, basically groups of related people. Improvements in farming techniques and a more efficient division of labor led to what seemed like an undeniable benefit. People began to produce more food than they could consume. However, they didn't face an obesity epidemic because alongside this surplus, a new class emerged. They figured out they could live without working by taking these extra resources by force. This pattern, seen in the Middle East, Africa, Asia, and the Americas, suggests it's rooted in human nature. From a moral standpoint, this surplus, which seems like a good thing, inevitably attracted those who wanted to seize it, seemingly a bad thing. Collecting taxes from expanding territories led to the need for record-keeping, which brought about writing systems. The oldest Sumerian clay tablets from around 4,500 years ago, like those found in Lagash, describe a system of overseers making sure no one evaded taxes. Yesterday's bandits, acting mostly out of self-interest, inadvertently began laying the foundations of civilization. According to the traditional historical view, the period from the first civilizations until the fall of Rome in the 5th century AD is often referred to as the Age of Slavery. However, in most ancient societies, slaves were not the primary workforce. Slaves were seen as speaking tools, entirely controlled by their owners. And there was a specific reason why the ancient world didn't fully split into slave owners and slaves. Slavery was only profitable under certain conditions. The first was a consistent supply of adults fit for work. Slave owners, even while using others' labor, had to organize housing, food, and basic care. Raising children, on the other hand, was costly and decreased productivity for women. Kids take a long time to grow up and often don't survive to adulthood, yet they still require resources. This is why it was often more efficient to acquire adult slaves, usually war captives or debtors. As long as the Romans waged expansionist wars, they had a steady flow of new slaves. But when conquests slowed, their economy suffered. Similarly, the rise of slavery in the early modern period was tied to the discovery of new lands where locals could be easily enslaved, sometimes with a show of force or by offering gifts to the local elites. The second condition for effective slavery was the simplicity of the tasks involved. The main issue was a lack of motivation among slaves. Generally, slaves didn't want to learn or do a good job. Although there were exceptions in the ancient world, they were rare. Typically, slaves were used in agriculture. Even then, Roman writer Columela's work on farming lamented, "I often hear our leaders blaming the land for being barren, or the climate for being unsuitable for crops. I believe it's not the wrath of the gods, but our own fault. We entrust agriculture to the worst of slaves, as if handing it over to an executioner, while under our ancestors, it was handled by the best people and in the best possible way." But then come more complaints about how poorly the slaves work, who don't care about the results at all. Beyond that, slaves needed overseers, people who didn't work but still demanded a share of the resources produced by the slaves. Starting from ancient Egypt, economies often relied more on semi-free peasants. Egypt's ancient documents show the development of a tax system where officials, backed by armed men, would beat a peasant who hesitated to hand over a large portion of their harvest. If there was truly nothing to give, the peasant could be enslaved. During the off-season when no field work was needed, semi-free peasants were taken to build various structures. where they labored for food. Interestingly, this same practice continued into the Middle Ages, albeit on a smaller scale. Thus, the differences between slaves and peasants were often not very significant. Peasants had to worry about their own children, housing, and food, and their sense of limited freedom, however illusory, motivated them to work harder. In many cases, the land they worked on, whether in ancient Egypt or later in medieval England, wasn't theirs. It was leased from a member of the upper class. I've read Marxist claims that class struggle was the driving force behind the evolution of labor relations, but I'm not entirely convinced. When peasants and slaves were demanded more than they could physically handle, rebellions would break out. One of these took place in the mid-18th century BCE, when Egyptian peasants and slaves seized the capital and dealt harshly with officials. There's a quote about this. "He who had not even a pair of oxen became the owner of a herd. He who borrowed grain now lends it." Slaves became the owners of slaves. In essence, the takeover by the lower classes didn't change the social structure at all. Even after the fall of Rome, slavery didn't completely disappear and was present in limited forms during the Middle Ages. England, for instance, banned it in the 12th century, but this mainly referred to the church prohibiting the export of Christian slaves to non-Christian lands. Yet by the 17th century, slavery was back. During the Crusades, Muslim prisoners in southern Europe were kept as slaves. There are records, for example, of Saracen women being sold as slaves in Marseille in the year 1248. Muslims themselves were also involved in slavery and the slave trade. Genoa was part of this too. Between 1414 and 1423 alone, at least 10,000 slaves were sold in Venice. Even the oldest legal code in Russia, the Russ's Justice, lists sources for acquiring slaves: captives, self-sale, debts, and marriage to a slave woman. And today, experts estimate there are around 40 million slaves worldwide. Slavery hasn't vanished. Its decline after Rome's fall was mainly due to the fact that employing peasants became simply more cost-effective. Rome didn't collapse because of an uprising, so we can't attribute the decline of slavery to class struggle. Peasants didn't need overseers. They were more motivated because their family's survival depended on their work. And although a feudal lord could often kill a peasant without any consequences, formally, the law provided peasants some protection, giving them a sense of freedom. In practice, punishing peasants was often just economically inefficient. Despite not owning land, the peasants, who made up more than 90% of the population, mostly just handed over part of their harvest and occasionally did labor duties. They usually produced their own clothes, made ceramic pots, built homes from available materials, and gathered firewood for heating. If they needed something more complicated, like tools, they resorted to bartering. It's like in the 1990s in Russia, when many goods and services could be traded for a bottle of homemade vodka, though more often than not, people were trading food. In the end, their economic relationship with the state boiled down to giving up part of the harvest. Most of their labor was seasonal, and according to Professor Juliet Shore, a medieval peasant worked less than a modern American. But by the late Middle Ages, the state apparatus expanded, and there was less free land and fewer resources in Europe. In some countries, this led to serfdom, where they squeezed as much as they could out of the peasants, ultimately reducing their motivation and productivity. In other countries, there were reforms and bourgeois revolutions. Note that most peasants lost their land, and this impoverished mass became the foundation for creating a hired labor force, the farmhands, who, unlike peasants, not only sowed fields and harvested crops, but had to work 12 to 14 hours a day year-round to survive. Moreover, they often had no housing, so they had to spend part of their earnings on rent or save in hopes of buying something one day. Earlier, a house in the village was built by the community using local materials, and no money was needed for this at all. Meanwhile, such workers didn't need overseers anymore because unemployment emerged. If you missed the chance to row the galley, you were left floundering in the water, destined to sink. Well, not quite. For the poor who lost the competition, there were workhouses where people labored for the cheapest food possible. In one workhouse in Vendôme, workers were fed semi-rotten cartilage, which was dirt cheap as it was usually used as fertilizer. Child labor was common everywhere. Besides the barracks, there were cheap lodging houses where people sometimes slept hanging on ropes. Concepts like weekends or vacations only appeared in the 19th century. People lived and worked in conditions often worse than slaves, with the only difference being that they were much more motivated. This was partly due to the fear of starving to death, and partly because of the Reformation, which promoted the idea that work has a purpose. Over time, working conditions improved, and the workday became shorter. Can this be called an undeniable victory of humanism or the workers' struggle for their rights? Not really. It's not just the length of the workday that matters, but also the intensity of the work. Everyone probably knows that when you're motivated, you can get more done in a couple of hours than in a whole day. The 8-hour workday first appeared back in the 1860s in Australia and in some US states, and by the 1880s, it was implemented in places like the Carl Zeiss factories. Today, countries like Australia, Finland, Norway, and Sweden are discussing a 6-hour workday. Some companies, like Philemundus, have tried it and reported no drop in productivity. In most modern jobs, motivation is the main factor in productivity. After all, nobody can work at full capacity for 8 hours straight. The push to shorten the workday isn't just about getting better results in less time. The idea has gained traction mainly in wealthy countries with high incomes. The fact is, when people have more free time, they tend to spend more money, which means they save less and become more economically active. Reducing working hours boosts consumer spending, making employees more invested in their jobs. So the evolution of labor relations isn't about businesses making concessions, but about getting the most out of the employee. And those afraid of a return to feudalism or slavery can relax. That won't happen. Today's system of the stick, unemployment and low social status, and the carrot, higher consumption levels, squeezes more out of a person. A slave won't train in their free time to work better or read self-help books. A peasant family cultivated about 5 hectares of land and harvested 25 quintals or 2.5 tons of grain a year. At today's prices for rye, that's worth around $750. The peasant gave up half of it and consumed the rest. Nowadays, workers get part of their earnings as a salary, but it goes right away on utility bills, loans, food, and other expenses. It might seem like if you earn, say, 30,000 rubles a month, you'd be able to save up 300,000 in 10 months. And theoretically, that's true. But on the other hand, each month you're back to square one, earning the same 30,000 all over again. I won't bog you down with the math, but the total money supply in the country is such that if everyone suddenly stopped spending while somehow still getting paid, it would dry up within a few months. You can see the trend of more and more subscription services popping up. You don't buy things outright but sort of rent them and pay a monthly fee. Cars on subscription, electronics, software, even housing. So we're heading towards a world where you have to keep working just to maintain the right to enjoy the benefits of civilization. And you have to prove this right every month. The fact that it's more profitable for the owner to have hired workers rather than slaves or peasants who will bring in more income doesn't mean that the worker himself will be just as exhausted by the end of the day. You can dig a hole with your hands, a stick, a shovel, or an excavator. Naturally, labor productivity has skyrocketed, and working conditions have improved in most cases. But don't fool yourself into thinking this is due to some great struggle for rights or humanism. Some might say that today a business owner can't just get away with mistreating an employee. But honestly, there's no need. If you fire someone, there's always someone else ready to take their place. But killing or exiling a slave or a peasant would immediately hit your wallet, because replacing them often required an investment. Meanwhile, today, if a major corporation or the state needs something extra from a person beyond what they can currently get, passing a new law or amendment is just a matter of days. Our civilization is set up in a way where the owner can squeeze the most out of an employee, and this trend seems likely to continue as it has for thousands of years. Back in the Middle Ages, peasants, who were the backbone of the economy, gave up between 30 to 60% of their harvest to the feudal lords. In other words, 1 to 2% of the population controlled roughly half of all wealth. And if we recall the words of UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, today half of the world's wealth is directly or indirectly controlled by just 26 people. This video isn't about criticizing the modern world or calling for any kind of uprising. Most small and medium business owners are just cogs in a complex machine, investing as much time and effort into their ventures as their employees do. And time is the most valuable resource of all. What I want to convey is a simple idea. Don't look down on the past. We are tools for converting resources into profit, just like medieval peasants or Egyptian slaves, even though most of us live in far more comfortable conditions. The inequality that began back in the Neolithic age hasn't disappeared. If anything, it has only grown from era to era. It's hard to predict where our civilization will go next, towards true human freedom, or a situation where the price for its rewards becomes an unbearable burden. The world has undoubtedly become much more well-fed, but has it become freer, or have people become happier? And before you look at the past with disdain, take off your rose-tinted glasses and look around.